Hi everyone, I'm Any New Province, and this week we're going to find out if Slum Reaper is possibly Pauper Playable. Pauper players have been waiting for their fleshbag marauder ability for a very long time, and with the downshift of Slum Reaper in Ultimate Masters, we finally have access to that effect. Slum Reaper costs 3 and a black for a 4/2 horror, and when it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature. We want to be able to maximize Slum Reaper's ability by having it enter the battlefield multiple times and by having lots of bodies on the battlefield that we can sacrifice and recur with our other creatures. That's why I've decided to build around Slum Reaper by using one of my favorite cards, Escape Routes. So, introducing Reaper Routes. Before I get into the deck tech, I just want to let you know that you can like the video or subscribe to the channel down below. I'd seriously appreciate it. It's a great way to let me know you're enjoying everything, and it really encourages me to keep making great Pauper content. Alright, let's have a look at Reaper Routes. Because Slum Reaper is going to need a creature on the battlefield for us to sacrifice, I've included a lot of very low-cost creatures that can come down before we cast our Slum Reaper. We also like low-cost creatures because part of this deck is returning those creatures to our hand and casting them again. This means it's useful for all of our creatures to have Enter the Battlefield abilities as well. Most of the creatures with Enter the Battlefield abilities in black don't come with built-in evasion, so we're going to have to give Slum Reaper some help in removing our opponent's creatures before we swing in. I'll go over the creatures with Enter the Battlefield abilities that help us do just that first. Starting us off is 4th Bridge Prowler. It costs 1 black mana for a 1/1, and when it enters the battlefield, you may have target creature get -1/-1 until end of turn. I'm almost glad to be on the draw against a deck with X1s when I'm playing 4th Bridge Prowler. Our opponent will commit their unflipped Delver, pass the turn over, we'll play a Swamp 4th Bridge Prowler and kill that Delver dead. Next we have Ruthless Ripper, which costs 1 black mana for a 1/1 with Death Touch, which is awesome for removal, but it comes with an extra ability that's even more helpful if we can recur it. It has the Morph ability, which says you may cast this spell face down as a 2/2 creature for 3 generic mana, then turn it face up by revealing a black card in your hand anytime. When Ruthless Ripper is turned face up, target player loses 2 life. This is so helpful when we're playing a deck that's trying to attack with our 1-drop creatures. Decks like Tron and Boros Monarch have prismatic strands to stop our beatdowns. Ruthless Ripper can win through those abilities with loss of life. Finally, we have Crypt Rats, which doesn't have an Enter the Battlefield ability, but it is very useful as removal, especially if we're going to pick it up with its ability on the stack. Crypt Rats costs 2 and a black for a 1/1 rat. You can pay X mana to have Crypt Rats deal X damage to each creature and each player. You can only spend black mana on X. Next up, we have Mesmeric Fiend, whose Enter the Battlefield ability isn't necessarily removal, but it's still disruptive. It costs 1 and a black for a 1/1, and when it enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals their hand and you choose a non-land card from it. Exile that card. When Mesmeric Fiend leaves the battlefield, return the exiled card to its owner's hand. We're really hoping to return Mesmeric Fiend to our hand with its first ability on the stack. If you do that, its second ability resolves before its first one, and the card you exile goes away forever. Next, I'm going to go over the ETB creatures that affect our side of the board more than they affect our opponent's side of the board. This package starts with Dusk Legion Zealot. It costs 1 and a black for a 1/1 Vampire Soldier, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. I really like this mini version of Phyrexian Rager, not only because it draws you a card for a little bit less mana, but also because it comes down a turn earlier and starts attacking your opponent. Next up, we have another spicy card I can't wait to try out in this shell. This is Colossal Healer. Colossal Healer costs 1 and a black for a 1/2 Vampire Cleric ally. That's quite the type line. It has the Rally ability, which says whenever Colossal Healer or another ally enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. It's really hard to find Enter the Battlefield abilities in black that gain you a significant amount of life, but if we have multiple Colossal Healers on the battlefield, hopefully when we start looping them, our opponent is going to get drained for a ton and we're going to gain back all of that life we've been losing. Finally, we have Pit Keeper, which costs 1 and a black black for a 2/1, and when it enters the battlefield, if you have 4 or more creature cards in your graveyard, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. It is amazing to be able to repeatedly pick up Pit Keeper to get creatures back out of your graveyard. It does cost a significant amount of mana though, so in the early game, Pit Keeper might come down before we can loop it just to attack our opponent for 2 every turn. I keep talking about picking up creatures and looping them and things like that, but I never explained how we're going to do that. Well, we're going to use this, my favorite Pauper enchantment, Escape Routes. Escape Routes costs 2 and a blue and says pay 2 and a blue, return target white or black creature you control to its owner's hand. You need a lot of mana to create loops with Escape Routes, but we're going to be slowing the game down to a point where we can get 1, 2, or maybe even 3 activations out of our enter the battlefield creatures every turn to completely lock our opponent out of the game. Escape Routes is going to help us generate a ton of value if we have the right pieces, so I've also included Maul Drifter to keep that value train rolling. Maul Drifter costs 4 and a blue for a 2/2 flyer, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw 2 cards. We won't always be paying 5 mana for Maul Drifter though, because it has the evoke ability, which means you can pay 2 and a blue to cast Maul Drifter, but you have to sacrifice it when it enters the battlefield. We're absolutely okay with Maul Drifter going to the bin. It would be awesome to get it back with Pit Keeper over and over to continue drawing cards, but it's also a good evasive threat to attack our opponent through a stalled board in those very slow games. Finally, we have just one more value creature that we can loop with Escape Routes. It's Thorn of the Black Rose, and it can completely shut down certain matchups. It costs 3 and a black for a 1/3 human assassin with Death Touch, and when it enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch, which means you draw a card at the beginning of each of your end steps, but if someone who isn't the Monarch deals combat damage to you, they become the Monarch and get to start drawing that extra card instead. The last bit of our deck is just a ton of removal and a little bit of counter magic to make sure those games go as long as we need them to generate our Escape Routes loops. The first removal spell we're running is Disfigure. It costs 1 black mana for an instant that gives target creature -2/-2 until end of turn. You absolutely need Disfigures in these removal heavy decks. They kill Ninja of the Deep Hours, they kill a flipped Delver, and they can kill one of your opponent's super important elves early in the game. We've also got 1 copy of Doomblade. This is going to help us kill any creature that isn't black. It's just awesome to have a catch-all removal spell. It costs 1 and a black for an instant that destroys target non-black creature. We're also running 3 copies of Chainer's Edict, which cost 1 and a black for a sorcery and cause target player to sacrifice a creature. You can cast it again by paying 5 black and exiling it from your graveyard. We can pick away at our opponent's board with 4th Bridge Prowlers and Ruthless Rippers, but these Chainer's Edicts couple with Slum Reaper to make sure our opponent can't stick a single threat for the entire game. Finally, our last non-land card is Soul Manipulation. It costs 1 blue-black for an instant, and you're able to choose one or both counter target creature spell and or return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Creatures are inevitably going to go to our graveyard because of Crypt Rats or because of Maul Drifter's evoke ability, or we sacrifice them to Slum Reaper, so Soul Manipulation countering one of our opponent's creature spells will almost always be a 2-for-1. Even when it isn't, it can get back one of our critical creatures we're trying to loop with Escape Routes. Alright, let's have a look at this mana base, starting with our first non-basic, Bojuka Bog. It enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you exile all cards from target player's graveyard. We've also got 2 copies of Radiant Fountain, which enter the battlefield and gain you 2 life, but only produce colorless mana. We have to make this concession because our main deck against burn is so bad. We're also running 4 Dismal Backwaters as mana fixing for blue. We do need a lot of blue mana to activate Escape Routes multiple times. Dismal Backwater enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, it gains you a life, and when it's untapped, you can tap it for blue or black. Finally, our last non-basic is Dimir Aqueduct. It enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you return a land you control to its owner's hand, hopefully a Bojuka Bog or a Radiant Fountain. When it's untapped, it taps for blue and black. Alright, let's have a look at this sideboard. First, we have 4 copies of Hydroblast to help us in that affinity and burn matchup. We have 1 more copy of Thorn of the Black Rose for helping us go over those slow decks. We have 2 copies of Duress for fighting against counterspells. We have 2 copies of Nihil Spellbomb for hating out our opponent's graveyards. We have a copy of Chainer's Edict just in case our opponent is boggling up super hard. We have 2 copies of Crypt Rats because we're a little weak to super go wide decks, so this will help us with Wraths, and we can eventually buy back our own X1s with our Pit Keepers. We have 3 copies of Choking Sands because, trust me, the Tron matchup is gonna be brutal. And there you have it, Reaper Routes. We're going to be taking this deck into a league at twitch.tv/AnyNewProvince this Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Atlantic time. We're there every Tuesday night playing Possibly Pauper Pauper Playable decks. Before I go, I just want to remind you that you can like the video or subscribe to the channel down below. I'd seriously appreciate it. It's a great way to let me know you've enjoyed everything, and it really encourages me to keep making great Pauper content. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this deck tech, and hopefully I'll see you on Tuesday night.